Well, guys, I'm sorry how scary that thumbnail was. I really didn't mean to make it that super creepy. I mean, have a look at this thing. That's pretty wicked there, right? It's a dead John Calvin, a dead Martin Luther, and a dead Jonathan Edwards. I'm not trying to freak anybody out and know it's not Halloween, but I was thinking about the theme of dead mentors, especially as I gave a talk related to dead mentors at the Banner of Truth conference just recently in Mid-State, Pennsylvania. I've been thinking about dead mentors for a long time because it's something that's rather important to me, especially in as much as I've studied the works of Jonathan Edwards for such a very long time. So in this video, what I'd like to do is sort of recapture some of the themes that I talked about at the Banner of Truth conference. Some of you might have been there for that particular lecture. It was a short one, only 15 minutes, which was the time frame I was given. So I did hurry through it a little bit, and I thought, well, you know what? I'll slow it down a little bit and we can give the whole talk here on my YouTube channel for those who might be interested in finding a dead mentor for themselves. All right, so if you're new to this channel, what's up, everybody? My name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, please come check us out. Also, an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, the best place to go get a Reformed, conservative, Bible-believing education. Get trained by pastors. That's our motto. Talking about dead mentors. Our motto at RPTS: train or study under pastors. All right. Well, so here's what happened in my life. So some time ago, it's almost been 20 years now, I started studying the works of Jonathan Edwards. And the reason I did that is because I was at a period of my life where I was just stressed. I was a young pastor, pastoring a church that was probably bigger than I should have been pastoring at that time, Faith Church in Brooksville. Stressed at home, stressed at work, and I was also doing my doctoral work looking for a dissertation topic. And when our dissertation seminar instructor gave us some advice about how to choose a topic, they said this. They said, make sure to study something that's going to capture your attention for the next 5 or so years, because whatever you pick, that better have a hold of your heart. You can't get bored. You have to be relentless. You got to pursue it. And he even gave this advice. He said, try to choose something that when somebody gives your funeral eulogy at the end of your life, they can truly say that changed his life studying that topic. And so I thought about my life. I thought and I reflected quite a bit on it. And I realized that though I had love, I knew God loved me. I knew I loved God. I knew I loved my family. I knew my family loved me. I was ticking through the fruit of the Spirit, came to the second one, joy, and realized, man, I don't know if I have a lot of joy in my life. And so I turned to Jonathan Edwards, who is the theologian of joy, and I began studying his writings. I started working through all of his concepts related to joy, happiness, gladness. Of course, John Piper was a part of that. Piper turned me on to Edwards as the theologian of joy. Else I might not have known that. But it was certainly true. Once I started reading through the works of Jonathan Edwards, I realized, oh my goodness, he talks about joy and happiness practically everywhere, especially as he roots that theology of joy in the Holy Trinity itself, the Father rejoicing in the Son, rejoicing in the Spirit, rejoicing over us, and so forth. So I found that to be really profound, and that's what I ended up studying for my doctoral dissertation, wrote my dissertation on Edwards and joy, and I suppose the rest is history. I've been studying the works of Jonathan Edwards then for the rest of my life, and probably will continue to do that very thing. So Edwards has become my dead mentor. Now, interestingly enough, I'll tell you this about Jonathan Edwards. He himself, he trusted in and consulted mentors of two different kinds, living mentors and dead mentors. He had his own. If you read through the works of Jonathan Edwards, there's certain people that he really depends on theologically. One of them is Petrus Van Maastricht, who he thought was the best theological writer, at least his systematic theology was, of anybody that he'd ever read before. So I've been, too, also reading the works of Petrus Van Maastricht. But of course, Edwards was very much influenced by his own father, Timothy Edwards, as well as his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, who came before him. And so when you look at his life, you realize that my dead mentor, Jonathan Edwards, had living and dead mentors as well. Solomon Stoddard, very deep influence in his life, but after he died, Edwards did sort of live into Stoddard's shadow to the best he was able to do, but he also recoiled against that in some respects as well with the communion controversy. But you know what? Whenever Jonathan Edwards came to a poignant moment in his life where he had to make a major decision, he was not ashamed to gather together a consultation of ad hoc other ministers to look to for help and guidance. So, for instance, when he was unceremoniously fired from Northampton as their pastor, and I have told this story on my YouTube channel, he gathered together an ad hoc council of ministers and he asked for their advice. And basically there was three routes that he could take at that time. He could either try to plant a new church in Northampton if he wanted to, or he could take a call perhaps in Europe, most likely Scotland. He had some friends, the Erskine brothers and so forth in Scotland. Or he could go to the frontier and become a missionary to the Native Americans in the same wise as David Brainerd had done. And that's exactly what he ended up doing. He went to the Stockbridge mission and he ended up doing some of his best work there. Well, in my life too, I've really benefited from these two kinds of mentors, living mentors and dead mentors. And your living mentors are great because you can go to them and you can ask advice. Now, unfortunately, my best living mentor is now also dead. So that puts me in an awkward position. Dr. Wilfred Bellamy was a wonderful living mentor to me. He himself was mentored by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, so that's a neat little connection there. But I still do have to trust and rely on the wise, sage advice of other living men when I come to poignant moments in my life. But I've also learned this too over time, that it's good to have several dead mentors that you can go to. And here's some reasons why this is important. First of all, because dead mentors will give you a historical perspective that you might not ordinarily have. Now, every age, every generation, every century of Christians, we struggle with different things than other centuries did. For instance, we have modern technologies today which make a lot of the things that we do easier. I'm writing a book right now. I've got a laptop. Man, does that make it easy versus a quill and pen like Jonathan Edwards had in ink, right? So there's differences there. But even culturally, there's massive, massive differences. And when I look back at some of the things that people suffered through as faithful Christians, I personally find that to be deeply motivating. Some of the endurance, the difficulties, the trials, the tribulations that they endured, I find that deeply stirring in my soul. And so having a historical perspective gives me a little bit of perspective on my own life right now. And not only that, but it helps me to identify the sort of historical blind spots that we all have. Now, this works in two directions because on one hand, Edwards calls out blind spots in my life. Every time I look at his devotion, for instance, or his study habits, it really helps raise to the fore my own sloth and laziness by way of comparison. But we too can look at their culture and say, man, what's up with that? For instance, Edwards held slaves, which we think of as morally repugnant today. And so we can look back and critique the 1700s. But hey, they would probably critique our incessant use of abortion, which is a wicked sin in our generation, and they would critique us. So that sort of mutual ethical moral critique definitely is bi-directional. It goes both directions. So my primary reason for having a dead mentor is that I very often find them to be personally stirring and motivating in my life. When I look at the way Edwards was fired, when I look at his devotion and care for the Indian Christians that he cared for, when I look at the profundity of his thought and the way that he carried on his pastoral studies, I'm deeply motivated and stirred by that. Now, again, that could cut both ways because I don't think Edwards did a very great job caring for the people in his church. At times, he didn't visit them very much unless they called for him because they were sick. But the advantage of having a dead mentor, especially one particular dead mentor over all this time, has allowed me to then develop an expertise, a real expertise in the field of Jonathan Edwards studies. And this is what happens, and one of the reasons why I want to recommend this to you is because if you can latch on to a particular dead mentor and really become one of the best scholars in that particular field, then man, that's going to open up all sorts of doors for you as a pastor, as a lecturer, as a professor, as a Bible teacher, as a church elder, whatever you are. Having a specific expertise is really kind of a cool thing to have. Now, I'll tell you this, that most pastoral ministry is really kind of a generalship of various skill sets. Okay, so pastors have to have a lot of different skills. We have to preach, we have to teach, we have to administer, we have to counsel. We got to know some Greek, some Hebrew, some ancient literature. We got to know some church history, all this kind of stuff. Not to mention just knowing how to deal with people, various people skills. Put all that together, that's a real generalship right there. But having a specialty as a minister does sometimes set you apart from the others. And I like to look around at my presbytery and think about how certain of our ministers in Ascension Presbytery have developed wonderful sets of expertise so that whenever we gather together as a presbytery, we're worth more than the sum of our parts. In other words, I'm an Edwards scholar, but what does that mean if I don't know my church polity very well? But thankfully we have Jared Nelson, who's a church polity expert. Or what good is that if we didn't have a T. David Gordon, who's a New Testament and Greek expert? So put us all together, and we actually become a rather formidable presbytery of very educated and skilled and talented men. So that's a wonderful thing. And not only that, but at least from my perspective, having been able to study Edwards for years now really has given me the benefit of delving into the mind of a real first-class, first-rate, polymathic genius over the years. And that has been a tremendous benefit to me, especially as Edwards in particular has contributed across multiple fields. Edwards was a pastor, a theologian, a philosopher, an ethicist, a missionary, and so forth. So I've had the real advantage of studying truly the mind of a real genius. And even though I personally, I'm definitely not a genius myself, the advantage of studying the mind of another genius has at least put me into that echelon and forced me to think along the ways that a real, truly polymathic genius might think. So there's tremendous advantages there. Now, let me give you some advice if you want to be a scholar in a particular field. Let's say you want a dead mentor of your own. Here's what you have to do. There's three kinds of materials that you're going to have to familiarize yourself with and even master to some extent, okay? First, there's no way around it. You're going to have to work in the field of primary source materials. Now, basically what that means is the stuff that Edwards himself wrote. We call those the primary materials. So I'm looking at his journals, I'm looking at his diary, I'm looking at his letters, I'm looking at his personal narrative, I'm reading his sermons, his treatises, his short books, his long books. If you're going to have a dead mentor, then the first place you're probably going to start is the primary source materials, at least getting yourself basically familiar with their body of knowledge. Now, second, there's secondary sources, but let's actually come to that last, and let's move over to biographical materials, because I like to really balance these two ends of the triangle together, primary source and biographical materials, because as I'm studying a particular individual, I really want to know when in his life he thought about these things and how it is that the events of his life and his own time frame shaped the thinking of his theology or his philosophy. So biographical materials, in addition to being extremely interesting, help us to get ourselves into the mindset of that particular person. Now, third, let's go back to secondary sources, because these are very important. These are when other people, other thinkers, other writers are dealing with the same kinds of concepts. And often this is important because they'll give you a different perspective or open up forays of understanding into this particular thinker that you might not have seen yourself. Okay, so for instance, while I'm very interested in Edwards' preaching and his sermons, I'm not nearly as interested in his philosophical works. And so sometimes I'll depend on another scholar like Oliver Crisp, for instance, to help me to understand Edwards as a philosopher, and so forth. There's all sorts of other scholars that contribute in various ways that I can depend on by reading secondary source materials like the Edwards Encyclopedia, or, for instance, the introductions to all of the works of Jonathan Edwards and the Yale editions. Okay, so there's that. Now, let's talk about how to choose a dead mentor, because I don't want you to rush into this. I want you to really think about this before you pick a dead mentor, because I do think picking one is as important as actually studying that person. So let's think about three things here that would help you to choose who your dead mentor should be. First, quantity. Is there enough material to devote a lifetime of study to? Okay, so a good dead mentor would be somebody that you can go to time and time and time again and continue to glean wisdom from that person's life and resources. Okay, so just by way of example, I think that Justin Martyr is a pretty interesting, very early Christian. And there are at least three things that he wrote. Unfortunately for me, they're somewhat short, relatively speaking. And besides those three sources, we don't know a ton about the life of Justin Martyr. And there are some other writings that might be his, but probably aren't. And so that may shed some light on who he is and what he thought, but probably won't do a whole lot of help. So Justin Martyr, as interesting as he is, probably isn't going to be a good dead mentor for me because there's just not enough quantity of material there. When you're thinking about somebody that you're going to spend 10 or 20 or 40 years studying with, you really need to pick from the pool of the guys that have the most amount of material out there. And often, because they have a lot of material, it does mean that they've thought about a lot of different things. Now, not everybody who has bulk also has quality, but sometimes bulk does equal quality. In the case of Jonathan Edwards or John Owen or John Calvin, That is certainly true. Okay, so the second question then we have to ask ourselves is about quality. Do I actually enjoy this? Because, listen, this might be the most helpful thing that I say to you. If you don't actually enjoy reading this particular person, then don't do it. Life is too short to read bad books. We've all started a book and kind of regretted it, and we're like, ugh, now I gotta slog through this. I don't even know if I really like this. Well, if that's true for you, then why would you waste your time? I mean, besides the fact that maybe it's assigned to you, or perhaps you might really learn something from it that's necessary to add to your intellectual or academic tool set, okay. But if you're going to choose a dead mentor, you want to choose the kind of person that you're actually going to really enjoy and learn from. And so for me, reading John Owen is really different from reading Jonathan Edwards. Yes, they share a lot of commonalities and perhaps even a lot of doctrine, but here's the difference. I really like reading Jonathan Edwards, and I don't really like reading John Owen. Now, you might find it to be exactly the opposite, and that's totally cool, which is why there should be more Owen scholars. My heart doesn't thrill to read John Owen, but I'm very interested in everything that Edwards says. So obviously I'm going to choose him. So I would ask yourself that question. Do I have the joy factor, the happiness factor, the gladness? Is there a real desire to pursue and to know and to pry and to moor into this person? If so, that's probably a pretty good choice for choosing a dead mentor for yourself. And then the third thing I'd say is, I think is equally important, is this person going to help me on my pilgrimage? Because remember, it's not just a dead professor or a dead lecturer, but a dead mentor, somebody who's actually going to help you along the way of your Christian life. Now, again, I think, and this is my contention, that you should probably pick somebody that you actually respect. In other words, you don't need a dead antagonist that you're always going to be arguing against. You know, when you read a book and you disagree and you're like writing out little arguments in the margin of why that's not true, or this is fallacious, or bad reasoning here, or whatever. Like, if you're constantly fighting against the guy, don't pick him. I mean, I suppose it'd be cool to also have a dead adversary. That's a thought I haven't really pursued very much. But in a dead mentor, you're going to want to choose somebody who's probably leading you along the path of the pilgrimage of the Christian life, somebody that you respect. For me, that's probably going to be a person that I think of as orthodox and relatively faithful, okay? I personally enjoy studying the orthodox writers more than the heretics. That's just me. Maybe you like the heretics better. I don't know. But I don't want to be fighting against the pricks as it relates to this dead mentor, and so I'm going to choose somebody that I think is generally helpful. Presbyterians should probably choose Presbyterians. Baptists then should probably choose also Presbyterians. Just kidding. But pick somebody in your tradition that leads you along and is genuinely helpful to you. Okay? So let me just suggest a couple of possibilities for dead mentors for you. These would be guys that I think meet all three requirements for the most part. So we've got our John Calvin. I think he'd be excellent. Edwards, there's plenty of room still in Jonathan Edwards studies for you to jump in the bandwagon and join me in Jonathan Edwards studies. Charles Spurgeon, this guy over here to the far right is Petrus Van Maastricht, who you probably aren't familiar with, but Edwards thought of him as a dead mentor. And then there's Thomas Watson. Ulrich Zwingli would be really interesting because I don't think there's enough Zwinglian scholars. And then, of course, there's John Owen and John Bunyan on the bottom row. So these are eight suggestions that might be good for you. I'm not sure which of these you'd prefer. I will tell you that if I was going to just give you some direction, this guy here at the top right, Petrus Van Maastricht, might be an interesting one because not only is he relentlessly orthodox, but there's not a lot of PVM scholars out there. And more to that same point, PVM's writings are just now coming into English from the Dutch, or the Latin Dutch. And that means that there's a burgeoning field of people to write, think, and do doctoral studies or master's degree theses or bachelor's degree papers or whatever you want to do, your own independent study on a person like that, because the field is just so terribly wide open. There's going to be a little bit less secondary resources for you for him, as there would be somebody like Spurgeon, for whom there's a lot. But nevertheless, go back to my three qualifications and decide which one that you would really, really enjoy. Okay, so going back to Edwards and his mentors, when he was fired and he went to his living mentors for help, he considered those three options: splinter church at Northampton, going over to Scotland, versus going to the mission field on the basic edges of civilization at Stockbridge. And because they guided him, he chose the latter. He went to Stockbridge. And neatly, I think this is cool, a nice twist of history, Edwards ended up not only preaching some of the best sermons of his life, but he also wrote some of his most important works there. Freedom of the Will, The End for Which God Created the World, Nature of True Virtue, not least among them. So it ended up working out very well for Edwards. Now he's going to go off to Princeton and die later, but that's the end of the story, and we've talked about his death in another video. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful for you. It certainly has been helpful for me to have a dead mentor. And if you're interested in the fruits of my study in the life of Jonathan Edwards, I have a couple of books on Edwards that I might want to recommend. The first is my book on his Theology of Joy. And my second is his book on the resolutions, which he wrote when he was 19, 20 years old as a young man. Both very profitable fields of study for me, and both have borne quite a bit of fruit over the years for me as I've thought about those things. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll post links in the description of this video to those books if you want to read what I wrote about Edwards. But probably what I really hope that you do is go ahead and pick your own dead mentor, because I think you're going to greatly benefit from it over the years. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching this video. Do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.